And so the saguaro monitoring project is what we're interested in today. And this evolved from a few curious souls in my orbit that we were wondering what the hell's happening to our saguaros. They were falling over in front of our eyes all around. And so from that curiosity, this has evolved into a citizen science project, and it's got a lot of attention. So there's a lot of interest as we would expect. So it's essentially we're citizen science volunteers gathering information about the current status of saguaros in the Tonto National Forest. And that kind of brings me to today's topic of, our field inputs are based on visual observation, what we can see. Other than a phone with a field maps app installed and a measuring device, we have no other tools. Our training and experience give us some clues about the health based on what we can see. It would be better if we could lift the skin to peek underneath to see what is causing what we see. Obviously, as citizen scientists and in the Tonto National Forest, we can't do that. So we're relying on what we can see from the outside. But maybe, just maybe, if we understood how the saguaro functions, the physiology, we could do a better job of interpreting what we see. And that is exactly what Mike can help us with. He is an internationally recognized physiologist with special interest in photosynthesis in cacti. Hallelujah. That is running into Mike again. I've known Mike for quite a while now. He's a great volunteer. He's done a lot of work in the Tonto and with friends of the Tonto and directly with the Tonto. So I'm going to leave it at that and turn it over to Mike now. So Mike, tell us a little bit about yourself. And I am really excited to have you on a first of a kind broadcast for Friends of the Tonto. So Mike.
Okay, thanks, Don. One thing I'll correct you on: I'm not an expert on cacti, but I consider myself an expert on photosynthesis. So I was a Category 1 scientist with the Department of Agriculture, a plant physiologist actually, and I've been working on photosynthesis, or I had worked on photosynthesis for about 40 years, starting in graduate school when I worked on aquatic plants, and then later on, I went up to a number of different kinds of plants. And just before retiring, I was working on cotton and specifically how heat stress affects photosynthesis. And I worked at the interface between biochemistry, physiology, and molecular biology. So a lot of lab rat kind of work, but we did get out in the field occasionally to sort of verify our hypothesis. So that's sort of it in a nutshell. I have an interest in cacti. I understand them physiologically, and hopefully I can present some information that might be of use to this group in terms of what you're doing monitoring. So I can start with a slide if you want. Okay, so and again, if folks have questions, I try not to make this a seminar, but it actually turned out to be a seminar. So if folks have questions, please raise your hand or just speak out, and I can answer as we go along. So let me start here. Okay, so Don and I got together recently and we compared our ugly pictures of saguaros, and I've noticed the same thing that you folks have noticed in your group that the saguaros are dying off. We're seeing a lot of deadening of the tissue, actually dissolving of the tissue. We're seeing this bacterial necrosis coming in and oozing that we're seeing. And as a physiologist, of course, I'm wondering why. And I hopefully will present data that will convince you that this is a likely consequence of heat stress, possibly with coupled with drought stress. And that's what I hope to conclude with, and then give you perhaps some directions to head in the future. So you're all familiar with this graph. This is 2,000 years of global temperature data. You can see the temperature has been relatively constant over 2,000 years, and in the last 150 to 200 years, we've seen this rapid increase in temperature that's due to the carbon emissions in the industrial age. And so rapid global warming due to fossil fuel emissions by what Edward Abbey calls industrial man, and I think that's a great term to use. But it's due to the burning of fossil fuel and the much higher levels of CO2 that are in the environment. And if we go out another 20,000 years, it turns out I didn't realize this until I did some research for this talk, but saguaros actually are a relatively new species, and they appeared right after the last ice age about 20,000 years ago. And over that time, in the temperature that they've experienced has only increased by about 3 or 4 degrees, with about 3 degrees of that increase occurring over a really long period of time, 10,000 years. And now we fast forward to the present day, and we're seeing that temperature is increasing. We're now in 2025, and global temperatures are now 1.5 degrees Celsius above what they were in pre-industrial years. So over a relatively short period of time, and in terms of saguaro generations, maybe 1 to 2 to 3 generations of saguaro, we're seeing this rapid increase in temperature. And these temperatures that we're experiencing in the present day are higher than at any other time in saguaro's existence. Saguaros, when they evolved, were in an atmosphere or in a temperature regime that was considerably lower than what we're seeing now. And so this is actually global temperature. So of course it includes buffering by the oceans, it includes the poles and the equators, everything else. So the question I had, and I just was interested in this from a scientific standpoint, were how have temperatures and precipitation changed in our specific environment in Phoenix, because of this, again, these are global temperatures. And so it turns out you can go on NOAA's website, and they have there's a national center for environmental information, and they have a searchable database, and you can find weather stations all over the country and all their meteorological data. And for Phoenix, the most complete meteorological data is, of course, at Sky Harbor Airport, and they have a rather robust set of data that goes back into the 40s. So we're going back about half of the industrial age. And so I got these data, and I just started tinkering with them, and I welcome you to do the same thing. You can download the information. It's free to download, and then pop it into an Excel spreadsheet and look at whatever you're interested in. And the thing I was interested in was, first of all, has the annual rainfall changed much? And it turns out there really has been little change in the total annual rainfall in the Phoenix area in the last 85 years. It's only gone from a little under 8 to about 7 inches per year. So that was one thing that was a little surprising to me. But what you find if you look closely at the data is that in the last, say, 20 years, 30 years, there's been no excessively wet years, basically since 1996. So that's shown here, and you can see there haven't been any years sort of above 10 inches of rain. And so I think that counts a lot for our drought. We haven't had these periodic drenchings that we've seen, in the past. So that's one thing that's different. If we go to temperature, I was interested, of course, in heat stress, because that's a basic interest of mine. And I was interested in the average summer maximum temperatures. So basically the daily highs in summer I'm defining as our three hottest months, June, July, and August. And so I took the daily highs from June 1st to August 31st, and I averaged them, and then I plotted them by year. And the data is shown here, and you can see that the average maximum temperature in the summer has increased by about a half a degree per decade over the last 85 years. And so I mentioned that we're now about 1.5 degrees Celsius in global temperatures. Well, in the Phoenix area, we're 2.36 degrees above what it was in 1940 in the present day. So that was an interesting phenomenon or an interesting result. And also, since the year 2000, we have had no years that have been below 104 degrees. So you can see that here. We haven't had any years below 104 degrees. And that was actually the average for 1965. So we've zoomed past where we were in 65. We've zoomed back past where we were in the 40s. And we're now in sort of a new normal. And I think what's the most disturbing thing in this whole figure, these last data points, where you can see that 3 of the last 5 years have been the hottest summers on record. And you wonder if this is actually a trend, and we'll see what 2025 does, what the summer of 2025 does. But it's quite disturbing trend. I did the same thing for the minimum temperatures, and we all know that the nighttime temperatures are hotter now. And so I was interested in exactly how much hotter are they. So I again did the same analysis. I took the summer minimum temperatures, the daily lows, June through August, and then I plotted those against year. And you can see there's a really strong relationship between the temperatures and the years, and with a slope that indicates that temperature has been increasing by a whopping 1.6 degrees Fahrenheit per decade over the last 85 years. So we're now 7.5 degrees Celsius warmer than we were in 1940. So if you're around in 1940, the average nighttime temperature was in the low 70s, and now we're above 85 degrees. So really a profound effect of warming on the nighttime temperatures or the daily lows. And again, if you drill down on the data, it's pretty interesting. What you see is prior to 1975, we've had no years that were above 80 degrees Fahrenheit for a low. And then since 2001, we've had no years that have been below 80 degrees. So all our years have been above 80 degrees. So it really speaks to how robust this relationship is. And it's interesting that if you look at where the transition occurs at the 80 degree mark, you see the transitions occurring in the mid 80s. And I'll just point out that in 1998, NASA's administrator, James Hansen, testified to Congress that the Earth was indeed warming, and it was warming because of human activities. And so if we were able to stop things at that point, we would have saved us an extra 5 degrees of warming that we're seeing at night. So that's the temperature data, and it kind of puts us in the current situation. So as a physiologist, I was interested in some insights into why these saguaros are dying off. Like, how mechanistically do plants cope with heat and drought stress? And I'll relate this all to drought in a bit. So I'm going to introduce the concept of heat tolerance versus heat avoidance, and the fact that photosynthesis is particularly vulnerable to inactivation by high temperatures. I'll talk about how water availability can affect heat stress. I'll talk about the CAM mechanism of photosynthesis that's used by saguaros and how it provides a lifeline for them to survive in the desert, but now might be a constraint for them. And then the future outlook, does limited adaptability because of the long generation time, 100 years or so, mean it's game over for saguaros? So first of all, let me mention that it turns out plants don't tolerate heat stress very well. But fortunately, instead of tolerating heat stress, they can simply avoid it. And they do that because they translocate water from the roots through the vascular tissue and out the leaves. So water then escapes the leaves, usually through the epidermis on the lower epidermis as water vapor, and it does that through specialized pores on the epidermis, the last layer of cells. And these specialized pores are formed by specialized cells called guard cells. And this is a guard cell pair, and this is another guard cell pair. And these guard cells, when they swell, they actually then produce an opening, and you can see that in the scanning EM picture. When they lose water, they contract and they close off the pore. So these pores are opening and closing, and when the pores are when it's warm out and the pores are open, this provides an evaporative cooling mechanism. You have the latent heat of vaporization of water, which actually physically cools the leaf, just like a swamp cooler does on a house. And it cools the leaves generally below ambient. And this allows the plants to avoid heat stress. They never see the actual temperature that is in the air. They're seeing a much cooler temperature. And I'll illustrate that in the next two slides. So as you could guess, then, if this only works then if there's adequate moisture. And so under drought, what happens is stomates close, conserve water, transpiration stops, leaf temperatures increase, and plants can no longer avoid heat stress. So this is a FLIR image, a forward-looking infrared of two beet plants. And what you see is that the beet leaves are blue, a cooler temperature than the surrounding air. And this is under sort of well-watered condition. When the plant on the right was subjected to drought, 9 days of withholding water, what happened is the plant starts to wilt, and the stomates on these plants, these little pores close down, and what happens is the leaf temperature on this plant actually starts to increase compared to the control plant. So the leaf temperatures are now starting to experience what the air temperatures are, whereas before, when it had adequate water, it was moving water through the plant and cooling the leaf. Okay, here are two more FLIR images. This is me actually in a FLIR image, and I'm standing in a cotton field. And what you see is that the plants in the rows are much cooler than the soil that's shown in between the rows. And so a dramatic illustration of how the plant temperature is much cooler than the soil temperature. And this is actually an aerial infrared image of a cotton field. And what we see is that we've taken different rows, and we've either watered them or irrigated them or not irrigated them. So the non-irrigated ones shown in sort of yellowish are much higher temperatures than the irrigated plants. Again, an illustration that by moving water, cotton and a lot of other plants can avoid heat stress. And cotton will shut down photosynthesis at about 35 degrees, so about 94 degrees Fahrenheit. But the leaf temperatures never get that high if the crop is well maintained and well watered. So it turns out that saguaros do things totally differently than many other plants, saguaros and other cacti. And I'll explain that in a minute. But first, let me just mention that when plants are under water stress, when the leaf temperatures do increase and they experience temperatures that are considerably above what they normally consider, this is a condition that inhibits photosynthesis. So I'll remind you that plants are green because they have cells that have little organelles that contain chlorophyll called chloroplasts. And the chloroplasts are really the site of photosynthesis. So light energy causes a splitting of water, moving electrons that then power the capture of CO2 and its metabolism into sugars. And then these sugars are used for just about everything the plant does. It's used as a source of energy, just like granola bar would be for you. It's used also for carbon skeletons, for all the plant processes: growth, reproduction, repair, disease defense, etc. So it's obviously a very important process, and it's inhibited at what I call moderately high temperatures, temperatures just slightly above where plants grow. And it turns out plants from more warmer places see photosynthesis that is inhibited at higher temperatures than in plants that grow in colder climates. But the bottom line is the process is inhibited when you get above the normal place where plants are adapted to. And I worked for many, many years on where the inhibition was occurring, what particular reaction. And it turns out it's occurring right here at the CO2 capture reaction. There's a lot of interesting biochemistry that I can talk to about that we did working about on this particular reaction, but suffice to say that's where the site of inhibition is occurring. Okay, like I said, saguaros do things a little differently, and they have a specialized photosynthesis called CAM, and CAM is an abbreviation for crassulacean acid metabolism. The Crassulaceae is a family of plants that includes many cacti, and it turns out that they were the family where this metabolism was discovered. And CAM plants are usually desert plants, and they have specialized anatomy. Specifically, they have a succulents, usually thicker, larger cells and thicker leaves, and they have water storing cells. And then they have an interesting physiology, which is what I was interested in, that aids in conserving water. And so all the CAM is going on in a saguaro on these outer ridges that are green, where all the green tissue is where photosynthesis obviously is occurring. And the interesting thing about the CAM photosynthesis is that CAMs, unlike other plants, assimilate CO2 at night. And they do this to avoid water loss during the day. So in a typical non-CAM plant, I showed you cotton, and that other FLIR image was for beet. But those plants that tend to avoid heat stress by transpiring during the day, those plants, their stomates, the two guard cells, swell in response to light. And at that point, the plants can take in CO2 in exchange for water and oxygen. And again, if it's warm out, the water escaping from the surface of the leaf will cool the leaf. The light then will drive the reactions of the Calvin cycle, and that CO2 that was taken in through that open stomate will then be incorporated into sugars. Okay, and that's the general situation for non-CAMs. CAM plants are very different. Instead of opening their stomates during the day, they open them at night. And the CO2 comes in, and again, in exchange for water and oxygen. And this is kind of an interesting question as to how much cooling is occurring at night when you have plenty of water and the CAM plant, like a saguaro, is opening its stomates. But anyway, because there's no light, you can't run the Calvin cycle. You have no energy to power this. So that CO2 is incorporated into a 4-carbon acid, and it's just stored in the plant until the light comes. And then when the light comes, the stomates actually close, and the CO2 is removed from the C4 acid, and it's incorporated in the Calvin cycle. And again, Calvin cycle is like any other normal plant at that point. It's incorporating that CO2 into sugars, making sugars, and using it for growth and reproduction and all the other things that the plant needs. Now, I'll point out one caveat, and that is that under severe drought, the stomates of a CAM plant will sometimes close. And this might be occurring a lot more than we realize. And when this happens, we get to a situation which we call CAM idling. And that is that the carbon that's captured and then made into sugars, some of these sugars are just respired, and the carbon goes back in, is fixed at night, is made back into sugars, made back into sugars, and then just kind of recycle through the whole process. Kind of a way to just burn up energy so you don't burn up other things. But this CAM idling is kind of an interesting phenomenon. And particularly when we have drought, like we're having now, this might be a really important factor in why saguaros are dying. So anyway, that saguaros are dying, to me, indicates that temperatures have now surpassed their ability to tolerate heat stress. So I told you about heat avoidance. Well, because a saguaro and other cam plants have closed stomates, they're not losing water during the day. Their photosynthetic tissue has to be, this CO2 capture mechanism is more tolerant in a cam plant. But I think we've pushed the limit now to where they can no longer tolerate heat stress that they're seeing every day. Photosynthesis is shutting down, and it's starving the plant for carbon needed for essential processes and energy production through respiration. And so again, I think this relates to the fact that saguaros have never seen these temperatures, and we're rapidly going up to 3 and 4 degrees Celsius. If we can't stay on the current trajectory, that's where we're going to be. And I think this long generation time of saguaros, where we don't have very many generations within this very short span of time where temperature is rapidly changing, means that saguaros are not very adaptable. So they're caught in a trap, and they're actually dying as a result. And I'll just go back a little bit to the meteorological data. And again, when I was working on this talk, I started thinking about this cam idling thing. And I thought, well, I've talked about annual rainfall, but what about summer rainfall? And so I went back to the data, and I analyzed that again for Phoenix from 1940 to 2024. And what you see is that 5 of the last 6 years have had below average rainfall in the summer. And so, that's a death knell to a saguaro in terms of heat stress, because this low summer rainfall makes these high summer temperatures that it's seeing especially lethal, because they're probably stuck in a closed form in cam idling. So when summer rainfall is low, plants are really probably spending too much time cam idling. And when they're cam idling, they're surviving, but they're not accumulating any carbon. And that's, unfortunate, because there's big offsets caused by inhibition of photosynthesis on the very hot days, and probably a lot too much respiration at night. So that's kind of, I think, where we're at, and what my analysis sort of indicates. And so this kind of leads me to some questions about saguaro mortality and heat stress that you folks can answer maybe through the monitoring program. And I'll put in a real strong plug that you might want to buy some thermometers and actually do some measurements, because we don't know about how hot saguaros are getting. And you can buy handheld FLIR cameras and take pictures of saguaros and see exactly how hot they are, and maybe start addressing some questions. And some of the questions I have is, one of them is the mortality rate lower when the nights are cooler? So you can measure the effect of elevation, and maybe we already know what the mortality rate is in a place like Tucson, or maybe on a north-facing slope or something like that. But you can measure that effect both on mortality and maybe measure some temperatures to get an indication of what's going on. I'm also interested in the question, is the mortality rate from heat stress higher under water deficit? I mean, obviously there's a specific effect of drought, and the plant runs out of water, can't do a lot of things. But are plants in cam idling hotter than during the day shift? So if a plant water is held from a plant, does it go into cam idling? And are those plants during the day much hotter because they haven't opened their stomates at night? Because like I said, we know nothing about how much cooling is occurring at night. So you can measure the effect of water availability on temperature and mortality. And then some bigger, for example, more tolerant, because they're derived from more tolerant seeds and seedlings. You figure a seedling that's developing now is experiencing a much, much hotter temperature than its parent did 100 years ago. So we might be able to determine if the younger cohort of saguaros are more heat tolerant. And finally, Can we select for heat tolerant individuals, maybe at the seedling stage in controlled environments, and then use those for restoration? So maybe to determine the genetic variability in heat tolerance among saguaros and see if there is in fact much variability inherently, and perhaps if we have a restoration project, use those more heat tolerant individuals for restoring the cactus. So that's about it. And again, I'd be happy to talk about it. I try not to get too much into the weeds, but I hope that'll give you a flavor for heat stress in plants.
Excuse me. Fantastic, Mike. I don't think I've learned that much in a 45-minute presentation in a long time. So, 35-minute presentation. So, Mike, one of the concerns that comes up is the marooning. We see a lot of saguaros that are turning red. And you had indicated to me that that's a natural phenomenon with the plants. Can you talk a little bit about what happens to cause that red, and is it life-threatening?
Yeah, I based on what I know from other plants, I'd say it's not life-threatening, and it's a transient response. I've noted this is what happens with a lot of plants, and it's a cold phenomenon actually. They will build up a pigment called anthocyanins when they experience a cold shock. And those anthocyanins do is they protect the chlorophylls from burning up. Because generally when it's cold out, metabolism can't work as fast. And so it's kind of like a sunscreen. And in my experience with other plants, it tends to go away and there's no problem with it. It's just that it's there transiently for a couple of months or something like that. So I think a bigger concern is the browning and yellowing that we're seeing of the trunks, where the chlorophyll and the chlorophyll containing cells are actually dying. I think that's a much bigger cause for concern. Does that make sense?
Do you think the marooning is reversible with rain or with water?
With temperature. Once we're out of the cold nights, I think that pigment goes away. It's a water soluble pigment,
This is the coolest time of the year right now, and we're seeing a lot of that. So I thought it was related to the drought.
No, I think it's related to well, it could be indirectly related because if the plant is stressed anyway, it's going to need more of that pigment, but to protect the chlorophylls. I mean, one of the problems being a plant in Arizona is you're always bombarded with solar energy, and you need to metabolize, carbon in order to dissipate the energy. And by putting on some sunscreen, that kind of helps you when you don't have enough temperature, high enough temperature to metabolize the carbon. But I think you'll see it'll go away once we're out of the cold nights.
So another question, Mike, was when the needles turn brown or black, what does that indicate?
Well, I mean, some of it's bacterial necrosis, I think, and then the rest is just death of those cells. I mean, it's just no longer, there's nothing the subtending cells can't feed those needles, and so they're basically dying metabolically.
Somebody comment that the marooning is not sunburn. It's from within. As I understand it, it's a chemical, like a sunscreen.
Yeah, it's a specific pigment that the plant makes. It's kind of the pigment in red beets, basically, and it's made by the plant, just as in a response to cold. So you have those fire stick plants that turn red. When I was a graduate student, I used to walk by a pond, and it was covered with this floating fern called a zola, and the pond would always be completely green until we had a cold snap, and the entire surface of the pond would turn red. The plant the zola were still there; they just had turned red. And then over the course of a couple of weeks, when we no longer had cold temperatures, this was in Florida, so we didn't regularly have cold temperatures. Um, that red pigment was metabolized by the plant, and the green appeared. It's like it's like leaves in fall in New England. Those pigments are already there. It's just you're losing the chlorophyll, and in this case, you're adding a new pigment and shielding the chlorophyll so the plant doesn't look green; it looks red. So it's what's called an accessory pigment.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see because I had never seen. I've seen the red spots and so, but now we're seeing swallows turning almost completely red, and seems like it's going to be a real struggle to get back to being a nice green plant again.
Yeah, well, I like I said, I don't think the red's the problem. It's other things, the
So
brownness and the yellowing. So, is
yeah,
there another question?
yeah. Is the plant still healthy even if all the needles are black?
I don't know that answer.
Uh,
I mean, it's an indication that the plant is under stress, though, for sure.
yeah, I would I think if it's frequent that I see the needles at the base of the plant black and missing, in fact, and so there's a lot goes on at the ground level and so you see quite often the needles are missing there. But if I see black needles and dark colors above that, there's some it's under stress one way or another. Yeah. Okay. So we've got a few minutes. I want to go through. Uh, Anybody else got questions? You can unmute and ask your question if you want to talk with Mike directly. I mean, I'm not trying to.
Uh,
But while he was talking, I just wanted everything to be
Hey, this
muted.
is Scott. I 2 years ago, I did citizen science for Desert Botanical Gardens and did a survey of saguaros in around our community along the streets and everything. And I was just curious if anybody's compared those results to what we're finding out in non-urban areas. Because when we, like within Lucentis, 60% of all the cactus are the saguaros that I surveyed had necrosis or were dying. And it seems like the temperature's higher because of the concrete, the streets and concrete and everything than they are out in the desert. It doesn't seem, the ones I'm looking at out in the forest aren't quite as bad as the ones in the development here.
Yeah, they're mostly transplants, aren't they?
Yes, you're right.
So that's always the great unknown, in my opinion, with saguaros is you don't know what's going on underneath them. And if people, I've noticed in my neighborhood, in Gold Canyon, the tops of the saguaros are just shrunken down. I mean, they're like shrunken heads on top of poles, and it's almost all in the planted ones. And of course, they chop off a good chunk of the roots to do the transplant, and so you don't really know what's going on underneath.
Okay.
So, and then I think you raised a good point. This concrete island effect. I did analyze some of the temperatures in another weather area. Unfortunately, we don't have complete data sets everywhere in the Phoenix area, and most of the data sets are pretty sparse. But there was one area that was a little more rural, and the temperatures were considerably lower, but they're still going up. It's pretty astounding how much they're going up.
Yeah, I don't know if everybody saw that picture that was posted on Facebook from Saguaro National Park of where they dug up the root system. I mean, that was incredible to see how far out, because I'd always thought the roots went about the same as the height of the plant, and those things were like twice to three times as long as the plant was high. And so when you cut all that off to transplant it, that's, you know, that's it's got to impact the life expectancy. I know it. I know the transplanted ones don't last as long as the, they won't live that 200 years. Uh,
Yeah. Plus, they're planted like in the median strips and stuff where they can't grow any roots anyway.
yeah, exactly. So, but Scott, you bring up an interesting question, and one of the things I looked at that study that Botanical Garden did, and you know they haven't followed up with it as far as I can tell. Comparing conditions. The Saguaro National Park has been doing a survey, I think, every 10 years. And they've been doing it now, like this is the third or fourth one where they've got a select number of saguaros. And you can, they have some data that I've looked at on the internet that shows and they have a much higher uh, density of saguaros in the park than we have anywhere I've seen up here. So they start out. We're looking at somewhere under 10 saguaros per acre, and they're in the like 30 to 35 saguaros per acre. And the other thing that they noticed was they went through early on. They didn't see many recruits. They didn't see many small plants. And the last survey, they found a lot more. And they're doing a much more detailed scientific analysis of them than we are. So, and they're doing it with uh, a concerted effort and over a specific time frame. So they get a whole bunch of volunteers. So they're covering they're doing so. It is interesting what they do. Uh, Liz, you had a question. If we were to measure the temperature of the saguaro's surface, what would be the most valuable information? A particular time of day, night or day, south side versus north side?
Yeah, all of the above, I think, is the answer. It'd be interesting to know, for example, how much cooling is occurring at night, how much drought is impacting heat stress. So when you're out of cam idling, when the stomate's open at night and the plant is able to transpire, is there a cooling going on there? And then when you do have cooling during the day, during the night, does that then translate into a cooler saguaro during the day? So in other words, your starting point is lower. That's one question. Whether, again, are the north or south facing, whether the temperatures are similar, how exactly high do the temperatures get? So there's a lot of questions, and again, we simply don't know what's going on with temperature. It's been reported it's well over 150 degrees inside a saguaro, but I don't know. It's just a number that I've heard, but it would be interesting to know and exactly what that temperature is. But I think all the things that you mentioned would be worth measuring.
So we should look into that a little bit. I mean, I think we should be able to get some thermometer, but decide which what to do and so on. I think that's something that's kind of doable, but we would need some real good guidance. And that's because just measuring the temperature, like Liz questioned, well, how would you do that?
Well, if you had a situation where you knew, for example, there was pretty good water, say at the Desert Botanical Garden, I don't know if they water their saguaros, but if they do, that would be valuable to know whether those saguaros are cooler or not. And again, going outdoor, it would require going out during the heat of the day and measuring them. But that's why I think FLIR would be the way the measurement of choice, because you just shine that up to the plant and take a picture basically.